Hello there again. We're Tony and Susan Alamo. Stay right in there with us for the next 1/2 hour with gospel testimonies, songs, and a message.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about another cult. My first video on YouTube was about a cult, and today will be the second one that I cover. This channel is about true crime, cults, and something I call heinous history, which are just really old historical crime cases that I find fascinating, and those videos tend to be a little bit shorter. But today is another cult case, and I'm willing to bet that you have never heard of this cult. I consider myself cult obsessed, and I had never heard of this one. And what's crazy is the people that started this cult were famous. They became household names all across America in the 1970s. They actually had their very own TV show that was nationally broadcasted, and I'm talking about the Susan and Tony Alamo Christian Ministries cult. They actually went on to start lots of businesses, and one of the businesses that they started was a clothing business where they designed these jackets. Not personally my thing, but they were very, very popular in like the 80s. And they were so popular, in fact, that a lot of A-list celebrities were buying them. People like Michael Jackson, Elvis, Sonny and Cher, Mr. T. What's really weird is while I was researching this case, I actually stumbled across photos of celebrities wearing these jackets like still today. It's just really strange to me knowing what we know now, knowing what he was doing to his followers, and knowing how those jackets were produced in the first place. It's just really messed up that someone would actually still wear something like that. I know people say to separate the art from the artist, but this man was absolutely disgusting. We know everything that he did now, and people are still wearing his clothing. But that was my little rant, and I'll shut up now. So like I said, this cult was started by a married couple, Susan and Tony Alamo. This couple was the definition of a match made in hell. They were awful for each other because they were honestly exactly alike, and that wasn't good. And this cult ended up acquiring hundreds of followers, and every single thing that these people did was controlled by Susan and Tony Alamo. They told them what to do, how to think, what to learn, what to wear, how many children to have, who they were going to marry. Like, they had arranged marriages and everything. There are still active members of this cult. Even though the two cult leaders are dead now, there are still people that are in this cult that still to this day completely defend everything that the Alamos did. And just a disclaimer before we officially get started, we will be discussing a lot of dark themes today. We're going to be discussing a lot of physical, mental, emotional, and sexual abuse of children. So please just be aware of that before you continue to watch this video. And now we can finally get started on today's case. So Susan Alamo was originally born Edith Opal Horn in Alma, Arkansas on April 25th, 1925. Later on in the case, Edith changes her name officially to Susan, but I'm just going to call her Susan throughout this entire case just so I don't confuse anyone. Alma is a very small town in Arkansas, and actually back when Susan was born in the 20s, the population was less than 1,000 people. So we're talking a very small little mountain town. Susan was born to Jewish parents, and she seemed to have a pretty typical childhood. I did a lot of research, and I didn't read anything that would suggest that Susan was abused in any way by either of her parents. And I couldn't really find out too much about her very early childhood. It did seem like she was very, very close with her father. She definitely seemed like a bit of a daddy's girl. And when Susan was very young, her father did go into the military, but he ended up contracting tuberculosis, and he was sent home early to try and attempt to recover. He did try to stay outside as much as possible. From what I can gather, he spent almost all of his time outside, and he would tell his daughter, don't come out here. You don't need to be anywhere near me. And she would never listen. She wanted to be where her father was at all times. And one of the things that they liked to do when they were hanging out together while her father was sick is they would pray a lot together. They also would read from the Bible a lot. This is actually how Susan learned to read. She learned to read by reading the Bible. So there's one quote in particular that really stuck with Susan when she was reading the Bible and watching her father die from tuberculosis. And that quote was something to the effect of, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, then you can move mountains. And in the mind of a very young girl who was very distraught watching her father slowly die from tuberculosis, she really hung on to this quote, and she took it literally. She really thought that if she had enough faith that she could heal her father, because in her mind, moving a mountain would be way harder than healing someone. So she fully believed that she could heal her father if she just had enough faith. But unfortunately, Susan's father did end up passing away from tuberculosis. And this was very traumatic for Susan. Like I said, she was extremely close to her father, and she just had to watch the person that she loves more than anything slowly die right in front of her. And this affinity for religion did not wane as Susan got older. It actually grew and grew as she, approached her teenage years. And she started doing this thing where she would force like all of her friends to come sit at a table, and she would make them sit down, and she would stand up and she would give these sermons. They were essentially sermons. And these sermons would go on for a very long time. And if her friends tried to get up and leave, she would like smack them and stuff and just make them sit back down. And as Susan grew into a teenager, she started to, gain attention from boys. She had blonde hair. She had tan skin. She was said to be an attractive person. She also kind of had that way about her, that magnetic energy where even if she wasn't the most beautiful woman in the room, she was the person that all eyes would go to anytime she stepped into a room. She was also extremely confident, and I think that definitely attracted people to her. It made her seem more attractive because of the way she carried herself. And pretty early on, Susan had decided that Alma, Arkansas was just too small for her. She wanted one day to leave that place and head west for Hollywood. She wanted to be famous. She wanted to either be a singer or an actress. And so she knew that one day she was going to do this. She was going to leave this tiny town. She was going to leave everything behind and forget that she was even from this place. And she was going to go try to make it big in Hollywood. But her plans got slightly derailed when she did become pregnant at the age of either 14 or 15. I've seen a couple of conflicting reports on that. And she actually did end up marrying the baby's father. So she was married by the age of 15. And Susan ended up giving birth and having a baby boy that she named Charlie. And I don't know who the baby's father was. I tried to find out, but honestly, it's really not super important because he doesn't come back up again in this story, because by the age of 16, Susan just decided that this domestic life was just not for her. She needed to go to California like she had always planned to do and try to make it big. So she divorced her husband, she packed herself up, she packed up her son, and she headed west. And once Susan arrived in Hollywood, she wanted to completely forget that she came from small town Arkansas. She wanted to try to pass herself off as someone who was born and raised in California. She wanted to pretty much wipe away the first 16 years of her life. She wanted to forget that she was ever Edith Opalhorn. And this is when she changes her name officially to Susan Fleetwood. And she does this pretty much as soon as she arrives in Hollywood. She is ready to make it big. She's ready to make a name for herself. And she really does try. She tries her hand at singing. She tries acting. She does all of these things, but she just wasn't having any luck. There's tons and tons of people coming in constantly to Hollywood for this exact reason, to try to make it famous. And Susan just constantly fell short. So she began doing odd jobs to make some money. So one of the jobs that Susan got to help make ends meet was working as something called a B-girl. I had never heard of a B-girl before, and you probably haven't either, so I will explain. She's hired to stand at the bar and just basically be pretty. And she would be given a glass of like tea or apple juice, and she would stand at the bar just kind of like holding this glass. And a man would walk in and see her and immediately want to approach her. So then he would go approach her, and then he would order a drink and tell the bartender that he was going to pay for the drink that Susan already had. So he's paying for his drink and then what he thinks is a second drink, but it's really just tea or apple juice. Hopefully that wasn't a confusing explanation. Hopefully you get what I'm saying. So yeah, this is what she did. This really helped to make ends meet. And it also put her in environments where she was hoping to meet influential people in the industry, people who could help her to make it as a singer, make it as an actress. And you're probably wondering, where is Charlie when all this is going on? And the answer is, I don't know. I tried to find out where Charlie was, who was watching him while she was doing these jobs. I have no clue. He definitely pops up like a couple of random times in the story, like his name is mentioned, but I know nothing about Charlie. And it drives me insane because I really like to know where everyone is and what everyone's doing in these cases. But I don't know about Charlie. He's kind of a mystery, but he is in California. I do know that. He is in California. I just don't know where he is. So one day while Susan is working as a B-girl, she's in the bar and a man walks in and immediately he sees Susan and he's instantly attracted to her, and he goes and he approaches her. And this man's name was Saul Lipowitz, and he would eventually become Susan's second husband. So Saul was born in Philadelphia. He was also born to Jewish parents, and Saul did not have a good upbringing at all. He was 6 years old when his family decided to just throw him out of the house. And I couldn't find out why they did this. All it said was that he was constantly causing trouble. Like, what could he have possibly done at 6 years old to get him thrown out of his house? But he does get thrown out and he just begins living on the street pretty much. So if he needed to eat, he stole. Like, this is just how he lived his life. And because he was, living on the streets, he kind of started to take on like this tough guy persona at a very, very young age. And he would pick fights with kids that were just kind of around town walking around and other street kids. He was pretty good at holding his own. He was a strong, tough little kid. But one day when he was 10, he ended up mouthing off to the wrong people. They were two older, tougher boys. Anyways, they get into this big fight and the two boys end up throwing Saul off of a pier and into some extremely cold water. Being thrown suddenly into very, very cold water, it shocks your system and it can make you, unable to really move your body in the way you need to swim. So that's already a problem. But also Saul couldn't swim. So he just very quickly began to sink down to the bottom of this body of water. I'm assuming it was a lake or something. He could not swim. He wasn't going to be able to save himself. So he truly thought that this was the end. And then out of nowhere, a pair of big hands reach into the water and pull him out and back onto shore. And the man that ended up pulling him out of the water and saving him was actually a local prize fighter. He was a boxer that was pretty well known in the area, and he pulls Saul to safety and he and Saul start talking and he took a liking to Saul. So he kind of took him under his wing a little bit. He felt sorry for this kid, he was just living on the streets. So he taught Saul how to fight. And this would later lead Saul to become a prize fighter himself. So Saul ended up making some money for himself as a prize fighter. He actually did pretty well. But then this career kind of led him down a less savory career path, which was working as a debt collector for the mob. You can kind of assume, especially considering the line of work that Saul has been doing, being a fighter, you could probably assume what he was doing when he was going to collect these debts, and he kind of became like the muscle for the local mob. So then this little mob career that he had led him to move from Philadelphia to LA, and he went to LA and he started doing the same thing there. He was doing mob stuff there too. So then that leads us to Saul and Susan meeting. They do end up getting married pretty quickly after they meet. And then on August 2nd, 1950, the two welcome their one and only child that they had together, a daughter whom they named Susan Jane. Now, just like with Susan changing her name from Edith Opalhorn to Susan Fleetwood, Susan Jane, the daughter, she later on in the story ends up changing her name to Christian. I think I'm saying that right, but I'm not going to call her that anyways because she ended up going by a nickname, which was Chris. We're just going to call her Chris throughout the entirety of the video. So now at this point in the story, Susan, Saul, and Chris are all living together as this little family. And there is evidence that Charlie also lived with the family as well. I saw a photo in one of the books that I read, and there were stockings hung for Christmas, and there was a stocking for Charlie. So I'm assuming that he was living there in the home with them. So because of the line of work that Saul was doing, he did gain quite the reputation within the LAPD. They knew who he was. He had a constant warrant out for his arrest pretty much at all times. So because of this, he was in and out of jail a lot. He was on the run sometimes. So he was not a constant presence within the Lipowitz household, and that would leave Susan and Chris to fend for themselves. So Susan had to find a way to bring in money into the household because she couldn't depend on Saul all the time because he was constantly getting put in prison. And I do think that his mafia friends were helping out when they could, but I do know that Susan and Chris lived in absolute poverty most of the time. They were always scrounging up money for food. They were always getting chased by landlords. They were constantly having to move apartments because they couldn't pay their rent. Now, because Saul was gone a lot, Susan did have several, and I mean several, affairs with various men. And a lot of these men were people who she thought she could get something from, like people within the entertainment industry. She would sleep with a lot of these men, date a lot of these men in hopes that they could help her to make it big within the industry. And this is probably a good time to mention that Chris is a very talented singer. She, even from a very young age, I'm talking like 5, 6 years old, she had an amazing voice. And Susan definitely tried to capitalize on this talent that her daughter had. Susan was the type that was always looking to either con someone or use someone to get money. She was extremely money hungry. She always had her claws out. And her daughter could sing. So she was always putting Chris in these really humiliating positions that she didn't want to be in. And there was one time that I read about in the book that I read about this case, which was actually written by Chris. She wrote this book about her entire life, about her experience within this cult, about her childhood growing up with her mother, which was awful, by the way. But anyways, there's one time in particular that Chris talks about. She was very young. And she and her mom went into this diner that they went into quite a bit, and they knew one of the waitresses that worked there. And this waitress was very familiar with Susan in all of her ways and how she was constantly looking for anyone in the industry that she could talk to about, you know, herself or her daughter. And so the waitress ends up tipping her off and saying, "Hey, just letting you know, this big time record producer," or I can't remember if it was a record producer or if it was a movie producer. I cannot remember, but someone big in the industry is here right now in the restaurant. So she then tells her daughter that she needs to stand up in the middle of this crowded diner and just start singing. She didn't care what she's saying, just start singing randomly out of nowhere. And Chris was not like Susan. She was not an all eyes on me kind of person, and she didn't want to do this at all. Her mother forced her, and so she had to get up in front of all these people and just randomly start singing. And I can't remember what she's saying, if it was like maybe Somewhere Over the Rainbow or something like that. I can't remember what it was, but she just started belting out this song in the middle of this diner in front of all these random people. And oh my God, like I cannot even imagine how embarrassing that must have been. But this was the kind of thing that Susan did to her all the time. So she really wasn't, unfamiliar with this behavior, but still embarrassing. So as I said before, Chris and Susan were left to fend for themselves quite a bit because Saul was constantly getting put in prison or he was doing his work with the mob. So they a lot of times had to figure out a way to make money for themselves just to make ends meet. And Susan never tried to make money in a legitimate way. She would always come up with these various cons. And one of her favorite cons to pull was something that she referred to as doing a church. So she would dress her and Chris up really nice, and she would go to one of the local churches in the area, and she would walk through the doors and head straight for the preacher or the pastor, whoever was in charge of the church. And she would just start pouring her heart out to this preacher about how she and her daughter were missionaries that had been in South America preaching the word of God and converting people to Christianity. The preacher, pastor, whoever would allow Susan to come up in front of the church. And so she and Chris would get up on stage and Chris would begin singing, and she would sing a religious song to the congregation. And then once she was done, that was then Susan's cue to begin giving her sermon. And she would give this very passionate sermon about how she and her daughter had traveled all over South America, all over all these different countries, preaching the word of God and converting various people to Christianity. And she would have these congregations completely captivated, and they would just be hanging on her every word. Like I said earlier, Susan just has this magnetism about her. She just has some kind of charm where people are constantly just drawn to her. And she just has this way where she can convince people of pretty much anything. So she's giving this really passionate sermon, and then she will get to a point in the sermon where she says this specific phrase. I can't remember what it is, but when Chris hears this phrase, that's then Chris's cue to start singing another gospel song. And while this is happening, a donation plate is being passed around the church so that people can open their wallets and give some money to this mother and her daughter who had been spreading the word of God. And of course, this was all completely fabricated. They had never been anywhere. Chris had never even been out of LA or Hollywood. So it was all just a big lie. And this just kind of reminds me of back when Susan was a teenager in Arkansas, when she would force her friends to sit and listen to her give these sermons. Except now, of course, she's older, she's, more well-spoken, and she really begins to polish those skills that she learned early in life. And then this would all be practice for what she goes on to do later in the story. So Susan did this doing a church con all the time. And, I think that a lot of people, if they were in fear of losing their home and they had children and they couldn't even buy food and they were absolutely, completely desperate just to survive, I do believe most people would do whatever they had to within reason to make sure that they were providing for their children. I get that. And I could even forgive some of these cons that Susan does if she was using the money that she made from these cons to actually do something nice and legitimate for her child. But that's not what she was using the money for. Susan would make quite a bit of money from these church cons that she did, and she should have been using this money to pay her rent or buying food for her child or clothing for her child. But she would get all this money from these church cons and just go on a spending spree for herself. She would go to all these very fancy shops in Hollywood and she would buy herself all these nice outfits. She would buy herself new makeup and hair products and all these nice things for herself. And she would take herself out for nice meals. But Chris saw nothing from these cons. And Chris knew that what she and Susan were doing wasn't right, but she had been conditioned to follow her mother no matter what. Her mother had constantly told her that she was worthless, that she wouldn't even be here if it weren't for her, and that she is the sole reason why Chris is even still alive and not burning in hell. And yes, that is not an exaggeration. She actually said this to her daughter. So Chris began to just believe that she could only depend on her mother. And it's really sad, but Chris's dad, he wasn't around a lot. So Susan really was the only constant in Chris's life. So she really was very attached to her mother. And being present for Chris was basically the only thing Susan did right by her daughter. Everything else she did was extremely harmful. She severely mentally and physically abused Chris constantly. The two of them had a very unhealthy relationship. And Susan knew exactly how to manipulate Chris. And Chris was preached to since birth. And these were not like nice Sunday school lessons that she was being given by her mother. No, she was being given fire and brimstone speeches since the day she was born. And Chris began to believe that if she got out of line at all, even had a bad thought about her mother, that she was going to go to hell because God would know. So Chris definitely began to grow a complex and really depend on her mother in an unhealthy way because she was afraid that without her mother, she was going to die and go to hell. this is what she had been told. So this is what she thinks. I mean, she's a child. She's gonna believe what her mother says. Her mother's supposed to be the person to protect her and guide her. Susan is a very manipulative person, and she doesn't care who she has to step on or who she has to hurt to get what she wants, and that includes her daughter. And like I said, Susan was extremely physically and emotionally abusive towards Chris, and she was also a very heavy drinker, which only made her moods worse. So Chris would come home from school and literally not know who she was walking into. She didn't know if it was going to be her nice mom or if it was going to be the mother who was going to physically hurt her. And when Chris would come home from school, sometimes Susan would just be waiting for her. And these were usually the days where she had been drinking, and she would wait for Chris to get home. And as soon as Chris would walk through the door, she would begin accusing her of doing all these terrible things, just doing things with boys and stuff like that. And Chris was a really young girl when this was happening. She didn't even know about sex or anything like that. So she didn't know what was going on. She didn't know how to deal with it. So she would just apologize and tell her mother that she was really sorry and that she wouldn't do it again, but she didn't even know what she was apologizing for. But Susan would just say, God told me what you did. I know exactly what you did. You can't hide it from me. And then after this, she would usually start beating Chris. And Chris would just be crying and begging her mother to stop and telling her how much she loved her. And Susan just didn't care. And sometimes Chris would put her arms up to block herself from getting hurt by her mother, and Susan would force her to put her hands down so that she could continue beating her. And this happened on several occasions. And one of the most heartbreaking things about all this is that Chris loved Susan so much, and all she wanted was for Susan to love her back. So remember how I said that Susan would have a lot of affairs while Saul was gone in prison or, on a mob job? Well, a lot of times she would have affairs with men who she felt were influential in the entertainment business. And she did this because she was trying to advance this non-existent acting career that she had. She never really cared about any of these men that she had affairs with, but there was one man that she actually did grow very strong feelings for. So in the late 50s, Susan meets a man named Vern Emerson. And at this point, Chris is about 8 or 9 years old. And I'm not exactly sure what Vern's job was, but I do know that he was successful in the entertainment business. Now, Vern and Susan's relationship seemingly started out as just a friendship. Vern was married and he did have children of his own. And at this point, Susan is still married to Saul. And Susan was not happy that Vern was already married, and she especially was not happy when she found out that Vern's wife was Hispanic. There's one thing that you need to know about Susan is that she is extremely racist. So the thought of Vern being with a Hispanic woman instead of a white woman just really, really rubbed her the wrong way. But Susan befriended Vern, and he began to invite Susan and Chris over to his house to have dinner with his family. And I do believe that this started out as a legitimate friendship, like just friendship. I can't really think of a reason why he would invite Susan and Chris over to have dinner with his entire family if it wasn't just a friendship at first. And maybe he took pity on Susan and Chris because maybe he knew that they were really low on cash and they were struggling to make ends meet, and maybe he thought he would be nice and invite them over so they could have a nice cooked meal in a nice home. So maybe this is why he invited her over. But Chris does remember this as being a really happy time in her life. She loved going to Vern's house and playing with his children. He lived in this really, really nice house, and everything was so nice and clean, and they had a lot of really good food. So she always ate really well while she was there, which was rare for Chris. She really didn't get a lot of good home cooked meals because they were always struggling so much with money. So this goes on like this for a little bit, and he's inviting her over for dinner with Chris quite often. But then eventually Susan does make a move on Vern, and unfortunately he does give in to temptation and he begins having an affair with Susan. At first, it was just a sexual thing, but it eventually did progress into an actual relationship. And I don't think his wife knew at this point, but he did kind of make Susan his like his official mistress, like his girlfriend on the side. Chris would see him coming in and out of the apartment all the time, and he started hanging around them quite a bit. He would take Susan and Chris for really nice meals at these fancy restaurants. Chris really actually looks back fondly on this time because her mother was so much nicer to her. Not only was she happy because she truly did care about Vern and now she finally had him, but also she was putting on an act because Susan did not want Vern to know what kind of person she actually was. She was definitely trying to hide the fact that she was physically and mentally abusive towards her daughter. So Chris really didn't get in trouble a whole lot when Vern and Susan were dating. And she ate better than she had ever eaten in her life because Vern had all the money in the world to take them on all these fancy dinners. So Chris was actually pretty happy at this point. And Susan was so happy as well. She really started to have very strong feelings for Vern. She might have even been in love with Vern. So this next thing that I'm going to tell you about, I just want to give a warning because we will be talking about the extreme physical abuse of a child. So if you don't want to hear what I'm about to say, just maybe skip forward about a minute or two. So one day, Chris is just coming home from school and she walks into her apartment and she comes in and sees her mother curled up in a ball on a chair in the living room. And she can tell her mother's upset. She looks like she's been crying, and Chris can just tell that something's wrong. So just trying to be a good daughter, she goes over to her mother and she begins asking her if she's okay, what happened. And Susan tells her that Vern has dumped her. So Chris just starts trying to console her mother and tell her it's all going to be okay, just trying to say whatever she can to make her mother feel better. Chris's attempts to console her just seemed to send Susan into a rage. And then she begins screaming at Chris that this is all her fault and that Vern left because of her. And then she tells Chris that she's going to kill her. Chris immediately begins to beg and plead her mother not to hurt her, but Susan does not even respond to this. She has tunnel vision. She begins to beat Chris worse than she ever has before. She grabs Chris by the back of the neck and repeatedly smashes Chris's head into a wall. And she does this until blood starts pouring from Chris's head. And she doesn't stop there. She then throws Chris to the ground and then begins to punch and kick her daughter all over her body. And there is blood everywhere. It's all over Susan. It's pouring from Chris. It's all over the floor. And Chris, for a minute, thinks that she's going to pass out, but she does manage to remain conscious during this attack. And Chris finally sees an opportunity to escape from her mother's clutches when Susan walks away for a second. So Chris then crawls to the bathroom. And when she gets to the bathroom, she grabs the sink and pulls herself up so that she can look at herself in the mirror to see the damage that her mother's done to her. And Chris said that when she saw her reflection in the mirror, she didn't even recognize herself. There was blood everywhere, and her hair was completely matted to the side of her head because there was so much blood. And while Chris is just standing there staring at herself in the mirror, trying to figure out what to do next, she can hear Susan still in the house, just slamming doors and rummaging through stuff. And Chris fully believes that Susan is looking for a knife so that she can come and finish what she had started. But Susan finally does end up coming into the bathroom, and she does not have a knife. She's actually calmed down now, and she's smoking a cigarette, and she just looks at Chris and she says, "Why do you make me do these things to you?" And all Chris could do was just apologize over and over and tell her mother that she would never ever do it again. But again, she doesn't even know what she's done. Susan then begins to tell Chris that she is mentally ill and that if it wasn't for Susan, Chris would be taken away to a mental institution and locked away, and she would never see Susan again. And if that were to happen, she would die and go to hell. And remember, this is the same kind of thing that Susan has been telling Chris her whole life, that if she escapes from Susan, that she would be struck down and she would go straight to hell. And of course, this is just a tactic that Susan uses to make sure that she can keep Chris under her control. And let's just pause for a second and think about the magnitude of what has just happened. Remember, Chris is only 8 or 9 years old at this point, and no one, I don't care how old you are, deserves to be treated the way Chris is being treated. But least of all, an innocent child. And just moments before this vicious attack, Chris had just been happily walking into her apartment. She had no clue that her mother, the person that is supposed to protect you above anyone else in the world, was going to beat her so brutally for no reason. Not that there's ever a reason to ever do this to someone, but Chris really was completely innocent. She had done nothing. And this is just classic abuser behavior, isn't it? You beat them, you blame them, and then you remind them that you're all they have. And Chris did end up in the hospital because of this attack, and she loved being in the hospital, which I think says a lot in itself. All the nurses were so nice to her, and she had a nice place to sleep at night. She didn't have any fear of being evicted. She had food. She had 3 meals a day, which was much more than she was ever getting at home with Susan. And when Susan would come to visit Chris, she would act all nice and play the part of caring, worried mother. And she would stroke Chris's hair and rub her hand, which honestly just, it really truly makes me sick. This woman is seriously the worst. And I'm not sure what excuse Susan and Chris gave the hospital to explain all these injuries, but it does seem like they were a little bit suspicious that Susan was involved somehow, or at least knew something about what had happened to Chris. But of course, they couldn't prove anything, and Chris wasn't going to tell on her mother. And before Susan would leave the hospital, when she would go have these little visits with Chris, she would lean in real close and get in Chris's ear and just say, "Remember, don't tell them what happened because no one will believe you, and they'll just lock you up in a mental institution." So of course, Chris never told anyone at the hospital that this happened. She was way too scared and way too loyal to her mother to ever do that. So now we're going to flash forward just a few years. Chris is now 12, so we're like in 1962. This is when Saul, Chris's father, Susan's husband, comes into a bit of trouble. So he works for the mob, like I said, and he is a debt collector. So his job is to be the muscle. He's the one that goes and beats people up to get the money that they owe to the mob. And one day it was just business as usual, and Saul was sent to shake down some local bookies that owed the mob money. So it sounds like Saul did get physical with these bookies when he went to go collect this debt. And then after he tended to his business, Saul left and went to a local bar that he visited quite often, and he knew the bartender there. So he sits down and starts talking to the bartender. And that's when the bartender warned Saul that the bookies that he just shook down were under new management, and that new management was the LAPD. And 2 members of the LAPD were actually in the bar at that moment, and they were coming for Saul. So Saul hears this and immediately stands up and starts to walk out of the bar. But once he got outside, there were 2 more members of the LAPD that were waiting for him outside. And then the 2 other ones that were in the bar walk outside. So now it's 4 of them against Saul. And they had baseball bats. And so they began brutally beating Saul. And Saul was left clinging to life. He did end up living, but he needed emergency surgery to save his life. And he had this surgery and he did make it. And then he went back home to Susan and Chris, and he was just trying to recover there. Now, when Susan heard that this happened, you would hope that a wife would be worried about her husband and want him to be safe, want him to make it, want him to live through this. But Susan didn't care. She actually told Chris that Saul might be worth more to them if he were dead. So she did not care at all that this happened. She couldn't care less if Saul made it out alive or not. But she did see an opportunity to earn some money. So she decides that it would be a good idea to expose the LAPD because obviously some of their members are involved in some crooked stuff. So she calls up one of the local newspapers, the Los Angeles Herald Examiner, and she tells them that she's got this big story. And so they agree to meet Susan, Saul, and Chris at their apartment the next day. They're going to interview them and take their pictures so that they can put them in the paper in this expose. And Susan did this to try to extort some money from the LAPD. However, this completely backfired, and all it ended up doing was putting a mark on Saul and Susan and Chris, and they ended up having to go on the run for 6 months. So they ended up packing up and going to this really remote location where it sounds like a lot of people who were on the run kind of met up because when Saul and Chris and Susan arrived at this place, there were a lot of people hiding out there, and they were living in absolutely terrible conditions in this hideout, and they were there for 6 months. And after the 6 months was up, Susan decided that it had probably been long enough and it was probably safe for them to go back home, but she did tell Saul that she was not going to allow him to live with her and Chris. She wasn't divorcing Saul, like she was not leaving him. They were still going to remain married, but she did tell him that she did not want him living with them anymore. So they do go back to the city and they kind of just go their separate ways, and Susan and Chris get this tiny little crappy apartment, their normal type of place that they live in, and Saul gets a place of his own. So now we're going to move ahead maybe about a year. So Chris is about 13 at this point, and this next thing that I'm going to tell you about, honestly, it really drives home just the kind of person that Susan is. This is one of the most psychologically messed up things I have ever heard a mother doing to a daughter. So like I said, Chris is about 13 at this point, and she ends up meeting this boy named Robbie who is 16, and the two kind of hit it off and they become an item. They start dating, they go to the movies, they hold hands, they hang out, they talk all the time, and they both really start to form a pretty strong relationship. And Chris is absolutely in heaven right now. She's always just wanted to be loved, and Robbie definitely gave her that. He was always super uplifting when it came to Chris. He was always telling her how beautiful she was. And Chris was a really insecure person, which isn't hard to believe considering what her mother is like. She's constantly been beaten down her entire life and told she was worthless and made fun of. And she really had grown a complex about her physical appearance. She thought that she was overweight. She just never felt like she was enough. But Robbie was always reassuring her that she was perfect and she was beautiful. And Chris was absolutely living a dream at this point. She was so happy. And Chris lives in this blissful little paradise for a while. And then, of course, Susan has to mess everything up. So Susan eventually finds out about Robbie. Chris had really tried hard to keep it a secret from her mother, but it seemed like Susan always had an eye on Chris even when she didn't know it. So Susan did eventually figure out that Chris had a boyfriend. She just starts telling Chris that she's a tramp and that if she gives up her virginity now, that no man will ever want her, and anyone who she gets with later in life will be disgusted by her. And it's just like, aren't you the one who is sleeping with every man in Hollywood except your own husband, Susan? And then Susan demands that Chris bring Robbie up to meet her. She wants to meet this boy. She wants to make sure that he's on the up and up. I doubt that she actually cared, but whatever. Chris finally gets up the courage to ask Robbie to meet her mother, and he very willingly agrees. He's super excited about it because he does really care about Chris at this point. So he's like really happy to be progressing their relationship and meeting Chris's mom. So they actually end up going right then up to the apartment, and Robbie is introduced to Susan. And Robbie makes a great first impression on Susan. He's very polite. Susan seems to really like him. She's even being really nice back. So Chris is kind of thinking like, okay, maybe this is all going to be okay. Maybe I didn't have anything to fear, like she's always worried about how her mother's going to react anyways. So she was really nervous about this meeting, but everything seems to be going pretty good. That was until Susan asks Robbie about his plans for the future. And Robbie tells Susan that he plans to go to Stanford University for college. And then Susan says, "Oh, Stanford, that's not cheap. Your parents must be very wealthy." So then Robbie's like, "Well, no, they're not rich, but they have been saving up for a while for me to go to college." And he says that he's also been working every summer saving up to help pay for his college expenses. So then Susan asks Robbie how much he's managed to save up. And Robbie tells her that he's managed to save $1,500 so far. And when Chris hears this, her stomach immediately drops. She knew her mother. She knew what was coming. Chris knew that she and Susan were flat broke at that point, and here this kid was telling her all about this money that he had saved up. So yeah, she knew that this was going to be trouble. And within seconds of hearing this, Susan begins shamelessly flirting with this 16-year-old boy and mocking her daughter, which is bad enough. But then Robbie turns his attention from Chris and onto Susan, and he also begins making fun of Chris and flirting with Susan. And before Chris knew it, she was now the third wheel. And before Robbie left, Susan tells him that he's welcome to come to their apartment anytime he wants to, day or night. Didn't matter if Chris was home or not. And Robbie definitely took her up on this offer, and he began showing up to Susan's apartment all the time. But he wasn't there to see Chris, he was there to see Susan. And Chris was absolutely heartbroken. She thought she was in love with Robbie, and her mother had just stolen away the very first boyfriend that she ever had. But Chris just had to sit back and helplessly watch as this all began to unfold. And Susan did begin having sex with Robbie. So this would be statutory rape. He's 16 years old. Like I said, Robbie would just start showing up at the apartment. He didn't care if Chris was there. He would just come day or night just to hang out with Susan and sleep with Susan. And sometimes Robbie would already be in the apartment when Chris would come home. And other times Chris would be in the apartment when Robbie would show up. And on one occasion, when Chris was home, Robbie ended up showing up. And when he showed up, she was in the kitchen making herself a sandwich. Robbie walks in and sees Chris and asks her what she's doing. And she just tells him, "Oh, I'm making a sandwich. Do you want me to make you one?" And he just says, "No, thanks. And I don't think you need one either." Basically making fun of Chris's weight, which he had always been so sweet and just uplifting when it came to Chris's insecurities. And I don't know why, but this specific detail of this whole thing just really, really bothered me when I read it. And I started tearing up when I read it because it was just total betrayal across the board from Susan to Robbie. And Chris is just, of course, the victim in all of this. She just has to sit by and let her mother do these things to her and turn people against her and ruin anything she has, ruin any little glimmer of happiness that she gets in her life. Chris just started leaving the apartment eventually when Robbie would show up while she was there. She just couldn't really take it anymore. So she would just walk out of the house when he would come over, and she would just go on long walks while Susan and Robbie were doing whatever they were doing in the apartment. And this went on for several weeks. And then as soon as Susan had tricked Robbie into transferring all of his savings over to her, he disappeared. And Chris and Susan never saw him again. So Susan used this boy, completely ruins her daughter's relationship, absolutely breaks her daughter's heart, gets what she wants, the money from Robbie. And as long as she gets what she wants, then everything's great. She couldn't care less who she hurts. And that's how Susan lives her whole life. And so we're going to flash forward about a year or so, and we are now at the fateful day where Susan Lipowitz meets Tony Alamo. So one day Susan and Chris are just hanging out at this coffee shop / bar called Aldo's on Hollywood Boulevard, and they went there quite a bit to just kind of sit and talk and hang out. And on this particular day, they were sitting at the bar and they see an acquaintance that they know, this like small time music producer guy that they knew. He walks into the bar, and I do not know his name, but it's this person that they were both acquainted with. And he walks in, and when he comes in, they see that he's got this other man with him. And this man was someone that Chris recognized immediately. He was known in Chris's circle as this really sleazy guy who tried to pass himself off as this big time music producer. And he was essentially just a con artist. He was a compulsive liar. He was seen as a creep pretty much. And this man was Tony Alamo. And like I said, Tony was always trying to pass himself off as this big time person in the entertainment industry. He would tell anyone and everyone who would listen that he had worked with bands such as the Beatles, the Doors, the Rolling Stones, and not only had he worked with them, but he had also been responsible for the success of their careers. And he had this pompadour hairstyle and aviator glasses, and he was dressed to the nines, looking the part of the big time music producer. But in reality, Chris knew that he was just a fraud, and this was all an act. And does that sound like anyone else we know from this story? Tony definitely lived by the fake it till you make it mentality as well. just like Susan. And I don't have nearly as much information on Tony's early life, but I do know that he was born Bernie Lazar Hoffman on September 20th, 1934 in Joplin, Missouri. So he was about 9 years younger than Susan Lipowitz was. And Tony's parents were also Jewish. They had immigrated from Romania, and from a very early age, Tony began to compulsively lie. This seems like a trait that he had from a very young age, and it stayed with him his whole life. He was a compulsive liar. One of the lies that he told when he was a kid was that his father had been a dance teacher to Rudolph Valentino, and he told everybody that this was true, and of course it wasn't. And he tried to pass this off as some kind of bragging point to anyone who would listen. And just like Susan, Tony always wanted to be famous, and he lived in this small town in Missouri, and he knew that one day he was going to leave this small town and head west to California to try to make it big. So when he was a teenager, just like Susan, he headed west for Hollywood. And he went by several aliases before he landed on Tony Alamo. I'm not going to go through them all, but the first one that he did go by when he arrived in Hollywood was Marcus Abad, or Marcus Abad. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it, but this was the name that he used when he first arrived in Hollywood. And this would be the name that he would use when he was trying to gain some success in the music industry. He wanted to be a big band crooner. This was what he set out to accomplish when he arrived in Hollywood. And he just really didn't have any success with it. He definitely tried. And he did claim that in the early 60s, he had a hit single called Little Yankee Girl. I don't know if that's true. And when his career as a performer didn't really pan out, he decided that he was going to move into producing music. And he started telling everyone that he was responsible for working with bands such as The Doors, The Beatles, The Rolling Stones, all these really, really famous, popular bands of the time. And of course, this was all a lie. He had never done any of this, but he would use this as a talking point to try to lure in newcomers that were just now coming into the music industry. People who were young and naive and really didn't know how the industry worked. And Tony saw an opportunity to capitalize on the inexperience of these people. They would see this really impressive portfolio, because that's another thing I should mention. Tony puts together this, it's like a book, like a portfolio, where he puts all of his experience and all the bands that he's worked with. He puts all this, information in this, I guess it was a binder or something like that. And he carried that thing with him everywhere. And this portfolio comes up again throughout this story. And so he starts showing all these new artists his portfolio, and they're seeing how impressive it looks. He's worked with all these really amazing bands. And so it's kind of a no-brainer for them. They hire Tony to be, their manager. But Tony would just take advantage of these people. Tony did get married and had children, and I don't really know much about his first wife and the children that he had with her. I just know that when he meets Susan Lipowitz, he is married and has children. And not only is he married with children, but he also has a mistress on the side who is very pregnant with his child. And at the time that he meets Susan, he's actually living with his mistress. I don't know if his wife found out about the affair and kicked him out. I don't really know why he's living with his mistress, but he is living with her at the time he meets Susan. His mistress's name is Julia, and she's actually known to Chris as well. Chris really knows a lot of people around the Hollywood area, and she knows Julia. Julia works at one of the restaurants that she goes to all the time, and she's a waitress there. Tony was completely taking advantage of his girlfriend, Julia. He was out, trying to run these cons and not really doing anything to earn legitimate money. And he was living in Julia's home, and while she was working lots and lots of long, hard hours at the restaurant, he would just spend all of her money. All of her checks went to fund his clothing, his nice cars, his jewelry, his haircuts, all those things. And I swear Tony and Susan are so alike, it's creepy. So this brings us back to that night in Aldo's where Susan, Chris, the small-time music producer, and Tony are all hanging out in the bar. And they're all just kind of sitting around talking. They had ordered a pitcher of beer. They're all just kind of drinking and just, chatting. And pretty much as soon as Susan saw Tony and saw, how well put together he was, was and everything, she begins flirting with him and, doing her whole Susan thing where she sees this influential person and she's going to try to see if she can get something from a relationship with them. And Chris, like I said, she knows what Tony's all about. She knows he's a fraud. She knows he's a con artist. She knows that he's dead ass broke and living off of his pregnant girlfriend. And she also knows her mother and knows that her mother's also dead ass broke and is running cons herself and is just completely lying to Tony the whole time they're talking. So Chris is just sitting there watching Susan and Tony basically just bullshit each other, and she knows that Tony's lying to Susan and she knows Susan is lying to Tony. So after a while, the waiter or waitress comes over and gives the group their tab, their check that they need to pay for the pitcher of beer. And as soon as this happens, Tony excuses himself to the bathroom, probably because he had no money to pay for this beer. And so Tony gets up, goes to the bathroom, and then the small-time record producer guy, he ends up paying for the beer, and then he tells everybody that he needs to leave, and he just says goodnight, and he leaves the bar. Now it's just Susan and Chris sitting at the table, and Tony's in the bathroom. So Chris takes this opportunity to kind of talk to Susan and make sure that she knows that Tony is a fraud. And so she's like, Mom, this guy is a con artist, right? Like, he's flat broke. He has no money. He's living with his pregnant girlfriend, living off of her money that she earns working as a waitress. He's got a wife and kids. Like, he's bad news. I've been told by several people that he's a creep. And so she's trying to warn Susan as best as she can, and Susan just tells her to shut up and to excuse herself from the table when Tony comes back, and then she tells Chris to just leave for the night and not to come back to the apartment. And so she's just like, okay, whatever, I tried. And she starts to gather her things and gets up to leave the bar. And as she gets her stuff to leave, Tony comes out of the bathroom and he heads back over to the table. And as Chris is walking out of the bar, she hears her mother say, "By the way, Tony, did you know that Jesus Christ is coming back to earth again?" To which Tony replies, "Yeah, I know it. How did you know that?" To which Susan responds, "Well, let's talk about it. We'll go up to my apartment and pray." And yes, in case you were wondering and hadn't caught on, praying has now become a euphemism for having sex in this story. And I also want to point out again, I know I keep bringing this up, but at this point, Chris is 13 years old and she's just been sent out in the dead of night by herself in this big city to just fend for herself so that Susan can hook up with Tony, go pray with Tony. And I don't know why I keep getting so appalled when Susan does these kind of things. I mean, I know by now that she is the worst. So Susan and Tony do end up going back to Susan's apartment and they pray all night long. And honestly, I just keep imagining like a lot of amens and hallelujahs just being screamed all throughout this little prayer sesh that they're having. Gross. And the rest is history. This match made in hell has now happened. Susan and Tony are now together and they become absolutely inseparable from this day on. Chris ends up coming home the next day and Tony has already made himself very comfortable in their apartment. He very quickly moves in with Susan and Chris. And remember, Chris can't stand Tony. She thinks he's creepy, and so she is not happy about this living situation at all. And to top it all off, Susan and Tony also end up offering to let Julia come live with them as well. And I have a theory as to why they do this that I'll say in a minute. Julia does end up taking them up on their offer. She does not know that Tony and Susan are together. Like, she doesn't know that they're boyfriend, girlfriend. So she is being told that they're just friends. So Julia ends up taking them up on the offer and moving into the apartment with Susan and Tony and Chris. It takes a few days, but she does eventually catch on that Tony and Susan are not just friends. All throughout the day, they would excuse themselves and go into the bedroom together and have prayer sessions. And sometimes these prayer sessions would last hours. And Julia would just be sitting there in the living room by herself, just waiting for them to come out of the room. And she's definitely starting to think that something's going on when Susan and Tony would come out of the room. Susan's hair would be all disheveled and her makeup would just be kind of smeared on her face, and Tony's, shirt would be untucked. And then Susan would say something like, "Wow, Tony, we were in the room praying for over 2 hours. When you're talking to the Lord, you really get worn out." Things like that. My theory is that they did this all on purpose. They were trying to make it as obvious as possible. This is a really tiny apartment. There was no way that they were hiding what they were actually doing. And they invited Julia to come live with them. They could have just let Julia stay in her own apartment, and she probably wouldn't have figured out that Susan and Tony were sleeping together, at least not in the beginning. So my theory is that this was actually done on purpose, and this was just a way to get Julia to break up with Tony so that he wouldn't have to seem like the bad guy walking out on his pregnant girlfriend. But yeah, so Julia kind of deals with this whole thing for a couple of days, and then she finally gets up the courage to ask Tony and Susan what's going on, and she tells them that she thinks that they're sleeping together. Susan just acts all like completely offended and appalled that this is even being brought up. And then she's like, "You're so ungrateful. I let you come and live in my house and you're going to accuse me of this." And Julia was in tears over this. She cared about Tony and she was getting ready to have Tony's baby, and now all these things are going wrong for her. Susan did kick her out of the house. So Julia grabs up her things and she's like, "Okay, fine, I'm leaving." And she's like, "Come on, Tony, let's go." And Tony's like, "Nah, I'm just going to stay here." Julia is just devastated. And I can only imagine, she's probably 8 or 9 months pregnant at this point, and she had been living with her boyfriend. She was super happy. Well, I say she was super happy. I don't really know if she was happy, but she was living with her boyfriend. She was living with her baby's father. There was some sense of stability there, even if it was a really messed up relationship, because Tony also has a wife. Remember, he also has a wife and children on top of all this. And now he's just basically abandoned her and their child. And it's just so like Susan to manipulate people and essentially gaslight them. She really is the worst. I'm going to be saying that a lot in this case, but she really just is the worst. And Tony is too. His time is coming in this case. I haven't really gotten to him too much, but he is even worse. He's seriously evil. I don't know. He's in a whole league of his own. So after Tony gets rid of Julia, now Susan and Tony just start pretty much openly dating, and they end up divorcing their spouses. And in 1966, they do go to Vegas and get married. And they actually end up staying in Vegas when they leave to get married. And Chris quickly finds out that she's not included in this new life that Susan and Tony are trying to build. Susan pretty much just abandons her daughter in California, and she and Tony take off for Vegas. And they begin living there in this crappy little motel. And Susan leaves Chris in the care of one of her really good friends named Tara, who was an ex-sex worker and who had had a really rough start to life, but had since turned her life around, and she had gotten clean. And she was actually a really good, positive, influential part of Chris's life. So she leaves her in the care of someone who actually really is a caring, nice person. And she was probably in a better environment than she had been in a while. Even though she was living under better conditions now with Tara, she did start to really miss her mother. So she ends up finding a way to get to Vegas to go see her mom. And when she gets there, she finds out that Susan and Tony are living in a motel called the Westward Ho. Chris arrives and she is super excited to see her mom, and she goes to the door and she knocks on it, and Susan opens the door, and as soon as she sees Chris, she's just like, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. You're supposed to be with Tara. I left you with Tara. Like, why are you here?" And then Chris is like, "Because I love you and I missed you. Like, I wanted to come and see you." And she's basically like, "Well, you can stay, but you have to get a job. Like, we can't pay for you." Chris is just like, "Okay, I'll get a job. Like, I just want to be with you." And again, my heart seriously breaks for Chris in this moment, because she probably thought that her mother would be really happy and surprised to see her. And she probably imagined this really nice reunion between herself and her mother. And of course, once again, Susan ruins everything. Chris does decide that she wants to stay in Vegas, so she does go get a job, and she starts working like odd jobs around Vegas in different casinos and stuff. Like, she's a change girl at one point. She's in the entertainment business there. At one point, she's like singing and doing things like that. So she does various jobs while she's living with Tony and Susan in Vegas. And pretty much all the money that she makes from these jobs goes directly back to Susan and Tony. And one very significant event does happen while Chris is living with Susan and Tony in Vegas. And I do want to give a warning before I tell you about this. This does involve sexual assault, so if you don't want to hear anything about that right now, please skip forward about a minute or two. So one day, Chris is hanging out in the motel that she shares with Tony and Susan, and they had moved motels at this point, so now they're staying at a place called Cupid's Wedding Chapel and Hotel or something, and it's essentially just another crappy little motel in Vegas. And Chris was just kind of sitting in the room, and she was resting, and she started to kind of doze off, and then she wakes up to Tony sexually assaulting her. He had grabbed her up and thrown her to the bed, and he was pulling her underwear down around her ankles. He then flips her over on the bed and gets on top of her, and he begins to rape her. And Chris is trying her hardest to scream, but Tony does put his hand over her nose and mouth so she can't scream, and she can barely breathe at this point. And she starts hitting Tony as hard as she possibly can to get him off of her, but nothing she's doing is fazing him at all. And as soon as Tony got off of her, Chris just jumps up and runs out of the room, and Tony runs after her. So Susan was actually there in the hotel whenever this happened. She was in the bathroom bleaching her hair, and she hadn't heard anything up until this point. So she comes out of the bathroom and she walks out to this really bizarre scene. She sees Tony looking really disheveled, like something had happened to him, and she sees Chris, who is not even fully dressed and who had been hysterically crying, and she's like, what the hell is going on here? What happened? And Chris was crying so hard that she couldn't really breathe. You know the type of cry I'm talking about, where you're having a hard time to catch a breath and you just can't get words out. So before she can answer her mother and tell her what's happened, Tony just yells out, "She attacked me." And then he says that she's out of control and all this stuff. Chris finally manages to find her voice, and she just screams out, "He raped me." And Tony immediately just starts denying the whole thing. And he starts telling Susan that she's crazy, she's psychotic, she needs help, she's out of control. Of course, Susan doesn't believe her daughter, and she chooses to believe Tony. I imagine that Susan wouldn't let herself believe that this had actually happened because she probably didn't want to believe it. And Chris is extremely hurt. She knew her mother wouldn't believe her. And so she doesn't even try to convince her mom that Tony's lying, and she just gets her stuff and she leaves. And after this, Chris does find a ride back to California, and she heads back to LA to go live with her father. So Chris ends up staying with her father for a little bit. Susan and Tony do end up staying in Vegas for a little while longer. And they end up finally coming back after they had come into some money. They ended up making thousands of dollars on some con that they were running in Vegas, where they basically screwed a bunch of investors out of a lot of money, and then they skipped town and headed back to California with all this money. So they end up getting this nice house near Malibu, and Susan decides that she wants Chris to come live back with her. I don't think, just based on what we know about Susan and how she is, I really don't think that she did this for any loving reason. My theory is that she didn't like the idea of Chris living with her ex-husband Saul. She ends up calling Chris up while she's living with Saul and telling her that she wants her to come live with her and Tony in this house. Understandably, Chris is like, no, your disgusting husband raped me while we were in Vegas. Susan, with her persuasive ways where she can pretty much talk anyone into anything, apparently, she ends up convincing Chris that she should come and live with her and Tony. Saul really does care a lot about Chris. He really does love his daughter, and he really enjoyed having Chris live with him. And it does sound like he was very disappointed to see Chris leave. I just felt really bad for Saul when I was reading about this. And honestly, I felt bad for Chris too, because she was, again, just manipulated by her mother into leaving her father, which was a safe place for her at that time. It was what she needed. She was getting true, actually sincere love from her father. So Chris does end up moving in with Tony and Susan. And while she's living with them, she ends up getting a job working very close to where Tony and Susan are living. They had like these boats, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, but they're like those charter boats that you can rent, like tourists rent them for the day. So Chris ends up getting a job working on one of these boats. And she is about 16 years old at this point. And while she's working at this job, she ends up meeting a man named Harry Moxley. And Harry was actually a British man that was just living in California and working on these boats. And I believe he was in his early 20s. I can't really remember. I want to say he was like 23, 24, something like that. And Chris is not honest about her age. She ends up telling Harry that she's actually close to his age, like she's around 23, 24. The two, like I said, they start dating and they become really close really fast. And within just a few weeks of dating, Harry was already telling Chris that he was in love with her. It was kind of like a whirlwind romance, honestly. It went really, really quickly. They fell very fast and very hard for each other. And all was going really well until Chris finds out that she's pregnant. She knows that she's going to have to break the news to Harry, and she is really afraid about how he's going to react to this news. So one day while Chris and Harry are hanging out, she decides that she needs to just get it over with and tell him. So she ends up telling Harry that she is pregnant, and he does not respond the way Chris wants him to. He is not happy at all about this pregnancy, and he ends up telling Chris that he wants her to have an abortion. Chris says that she wants to have an abortion as well, but she really didn't want to. She just kind of went along with it because she was just really worried about messing up the relationship that she had with Harry, but she really never had any intentions of aborting the baby. So Chris ends up letting Harry know that she doesn't want to have an abortion. She wants to keep the baby. And she also tells him that she's actually not 24. She's actually only 16. And long story short, Chris and Harry end up breaking up, and Chris decides to, of course, keep the baby. And Susan actually ends up walking in on Chris throwing up in the bathroom one day, and she immediately knows that Chris is pregnant. And there is a lot, and I mean a lot, of other things that happen between the time of Chris finding out that she's pregnant and actually having her baby. But I just don't have time to get into all the details of that. So I'm just going to skip ahead, and Chris ends up having her baby. She ends up having a baby girl that she names Tiffany, and she is now living on her own in an apartment. Susan and Tony at this point have lost their Malibu home. They went through all of that money that they had conned all the investors out of in Vegas, and they were now dead ass broke again, living in this crappy little apartment in Hollywood. And also, we do not talk about Harry again in this case. He and Chris do break up, and he's pretty much out of the picture completely. He never comes back up. So like I said, Chris is living with her daughter Tiffany in this little apartment, and she's really happy. It's just her and her daughter, and she's really doing pretty good. And while she's living in this apartment, she ends up becoming acquainted with one of her neighbors, a man named Ed Mick. And he was from Arkansas, and he had kind of just wanted to experience life outside of his small town. And so that's why he had come to California. So he was living in the same building as Chris. And the two began talking, and they end up really hitting it off, and they spark up a relationship. Pretty quickly after they began dating, they decide to move in with each other. They were both struggling for money, and they're like, you know what? Like, it's better for us both to just put our money in and pay for one apartment than paying for two. And they were living in the same building, so they just kind of figured it's pointless for them to both have their own apartment. So Ed ends up moving into Chris's apartment with her and Tiffany. Now, their relationship is going really well, but they do end up having a falling out. Ed had some jealousy problems, and so that began to cause a little bit of issues in their relationship, and they ended up having a really big fight one night, and it resulted in Ed moving out of the apartment. And they eventually do patch things up and they decide to get back together, but they do decide that they're just gonna live separately. Like maybe living together that soon was causing some issues. So Ed begins living with some of his friends in this house, and Chris stays in the apartment with Tiffany. This house that Ed was living in with his friends was kind of like a party house. There was a lot of drugs, a lot of parties, people basically coming in and out of the house day and night. And I don't really think it was a problem for Chris. Like, it sounds like they were getting along really well and their relationship was really advancing and they were doing good. But of course, we know that Chris is not allowed to have anything nice in life because Susan is always going to ruin it. So Susan finds out that Chris is dating this guy, Ed, and that they're really serious. And she calls Chris and tells Chris that she wants to meet this guy. And she tells Chris that she needs to bring him over to hers and Tony's apartment so that they can meet him. So Chris's initial reaction is no. But eventually, of course, Susan, being the persuasive person that she is, she does talk Chris into bringing Ed over so that they can meet him. Chris goes into this like, she's like, okay, I'm just gonna go in. I'm literally gonna say, Ed, mom, Ed, and I'm out of there. Like, she wanted to make this as quick as humanly possible. She wanted to limit Ed's exposure to her mother as much as possible. So pretty much as soon as Ed and Chris arrive at Susan and Tony's apartment, Susan launches into one of her sermons. And she says, you know that Jesus is coming back down to earth, don't you, Ed? And as soon as Chris hears this, she's like, right, okay, we gotta go. Thanks for having us. Of course, Susan was not gonna let that happen. So she's like, no, you guys need to stay. You can stay for a little bit, can't you, Ed? And Ed doesn't want to be rude. So he's like, yeah, sure, we can stay. And so they all sit back down and Susan launches into her sermon and she starts telling Ed how he was brought to her that day on purpose by God because Susan is building a Christian army and she needs strong Christian men to lead the forces when Armageddon happens. And she needs these strong Christian men because they're going to have to fight off all the evil that Armageddon's going to bring. She also told Ed that she had once been a big actress and that Tony was a really big name in the music industry, but that God had told them that they needed to give up all their worldly possessions and just devote their lives to spreading his word. And as this is happening, Chris is just sitting there and just helplessly watching as Ed's being pulled in by Susan. He is hanging on every word that Susan is speaking. I don't know what it is about this woman. Like, seriously, what is it? How does she get these people to listen to her? I truly do not understand. And before Chris knew it, Susan had everyone down on their knees right there in the living room praying. So after she's given her sermon to Ed, she then asks Ed if anyone is at his house right now. And Ed says, yeah, I have a few friends over. One of my friends, Chuck, he's there right now. So she tells Ed to go back to his house and go get Chuck and to bring him over to hers and Tony's apartment so that she can talk to him. So Ed actually listens to her and he goes back to his house and he goes and gets Chuck and brings him back over to Susan and Tony's, and same thing happens. Susan launches into her sermon, tells him the exact same thing that she told Ed, that she needs strong Christian men to join her army. And seriously, I don't know how this happens, but Chuck gets pulled into this as well. Like, how is she doing this? And so then Ed and Chuck then invite Tony and Susan back to their house because they know, like I said, there are people that come and go from this house at all hours of the day and night. So Ed pretty much knew that there would be people just randomly showing up at his house that night. So he invites Tony and Susan to come back to his house and basically just preach to the entire household. And of course, Susan and Tony agree to do this and they head over to Ed and Chuck's house. Susan walks to the door like she owns the place. She walks straight in the house, and she just makes this really loud announcement to anyone that's listening that this is now a Christian house, and whoever does not want to be a part of her army needs to pack up their stuff and leave. And I can't believe that I'm saying this. I truly can't. But people actually listened. The people who didn't want to be a part of that packed up their stuff and left. Like, no one knew who she was. She was just some random bleach blonde lady that walked into the house and started screaming at everybody about Jesus. And she spent the rest of that night just preaching and telling anyone who would listen that she needed their help in this movement that she was starting. She needed strong Christians to join this army, join this movement that she was creating to help her to fight off the evils that would come when Armageddon happened. And after that night, Susan and Tony went back to Ed and Chuck's house every night to give these sermons, and they would do all night services. They still kept their little apartment where they technically lived, but they spent most of their time at Ed's house now. It had now become a church. It was the base of her operation at this point in the story. And these services that she would do, like these all-night services, became super popular, and a lot of people from the neighborhood would show up at the house at night, and they would just come to listen to Susan speak. And in addition to these services that they would do in this house, Susan and Tony would also send some of these newfound followers out to the streets with like leaflets and stuff, and she would send them out there to preach the word and try to pull more members into their group. And if you hadn't guessed it, this is when Susan and Tony start the cult. This is basically the cult in its infancy. Like I said, Susan had actually really made a name for herself, but the unfortunate thing is Susan and Tony's path to fame would come at the expense of hundreds of innocent followers. And now that we've kind of approached the infancy stages of this cult, I think that this would be a good stopping point. Like I suspected, this is going to be a very long video, so I do need to break it up into 2 parts. Please come back in like a week and I'll have part 2 up. And if you hadn't subscribed to my channel already and you want to, go ahead and subscribe and turn notifications on. That way you'll be alerted when I post the second part of this video. And I should have part 2 to this case up within a week, so you won't have to wait that long for it. And thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate each and every click that I get on any of my videos. It really means a lot to me. Thanks again for watching. Bye.